Thank you, Richard. Thank you to the Institute for making this evening possible. And thank you to Richard in particular for inviting me to be part of this project over lunch about 3 or so years ago. It's been a journey, as they always are, and it's been a very interesting and fruitful one. I've had experience in a number of negotiated conflict resolution situations, but I think the best known one is that of Aceh, which was in 2005. You may or may not remember that Boxing Day 2004, there was a massive tsunami in the Indian Ocean. It impacted Sri Lanka quite heavily. It impacted Aceh very heavily. In Aceh, something like 180,000 people were killed. All of the low-lying infrastructure was completely destroyed, and it was a catastrophe of huge proportions. And a lot of people have, not unreasonably, said this was the catalyst for peace. And it certainly was a driver, but it wasn't necessarily the catalyst as such. What most people don't know is that 2 days before the tsunami, the Free Aceh movement, which had been fighting a guerrilla war with the Indonesian government for the previous 30 years, had agreed to talk. This was 2 days before the tsunami. And they had agreed to sit down and have some sort of negotiated process. The tsunami came, of course, that then provided greater impetus for those talks. But what we found was that even though the Indonesian government, it was a new government then, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who had come to office promising to resolve the war in Aceh, even with that sort of support, it was an enormously complex and difficult process. What we did find, though, was that the intersection of a number of other factors helped bring this to a successful conclusion. There was, of course, the issue of simply alleviating the suffering of the people. The Acehnese, particularly devout Sunni Muslims, and many of them were convinced that this was a message from God, that perhaps they had behaved badly and they were being punished. And I tried to persuade them that perhaps that's not the way God actually worked. And that led to another series of theological discussions. But there was those sorts of influences. So the Free Aceh movement immediately declared a ceasefire to allow work to start to alleviate the suffering of the people. And the Indonesian government also made gestures in that direction as well. But the Indonesian military, which operated then and still largely operates quite independently of the government, said, no, we're going to continue with the war. We're going to continue to prosecute what they thought was going to be a military victory. The international community, though, was by this stage becoming engaged. At that time, it was to become the world's largest aid program ever. About $5 billion was tipped in. There were dozens of countries involved, and they said, these countries that were providing a range of supports to try to resolve the problem post-tsunami, said, we can't work in an environment where there's a war going on. We want you to fix it. And they put pressure on the Indonesian government, and they put pressure on the Free Aceh movement. They said to the Free Aceh movement, we will never recognise your claim for independence, but we will support you if you negotiate for a peaceful resolution, without saying what that looked like. The process, we had to exclude, in this process, we had to exclude the military. They came in as spoilers. We had them on the Indonesian negotiating team, and every time we thought we were going to get an agreement, I think we had 104 points of agreement in the end. Every time we thought we were getting close to an agreement, the two generals who were on the Indonesian negotiating team would come in and wreck it. They would say, no, we're not going to do this, or we're going to do something else which will spoil it, which will undermine it, increase military pressure, whatever it happened to be. I complained about this to the Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. I said, we simply can't operate with spoilers involved in the process. They were removed. And removing spoilers from a process is enormously important in allowing it to then build constructive steps towards some sort of an outcome. Each of the 104 points was a hurdle, and each hurdle was difficult to get over. But not having the spoilers there trying to trip us up before we got to the hurdle was probably one of the biggest steps in favour of getting a resolution. The other was that Indonesia had been undergoing a process of democratisation since 1998. Its own interpretation of democracy. It's a very particular version of democracy, but they were subscribing, particularly under Yudhoyono, they were subscribing to broad, internationally accepted rules of democratic transition, one of which is controlling the military, bringing it under civilian authority. Yudhoyono was an Indonesian general, and in transition theory, generals, reformist-minded generals, are the best place to bring about that sort of a change, because they have the links back into the military structure. They have credibility. They know what levers to move to get particular outcomes, and their reform orientation gels with the civil community. So Yudhoyono was clearly the best person. So we had on our side, to get an outcome, we had a reformist-minded general who was a Democrat. Indeed, his political party was called the Democratic Party. To cut what could be a very long story short, we ended up agreeing around a form of words which allowed for Aceh to have its own political parties and to have an internationally supervised democratic electoral process. That was unheard of for Indonesia. The Indonesian law does not allow for local political parties because the elites in Jakarta believe that will lead to separatism. In this case, I argued for creating these, or having these parties being allowed to be created in order to resolve separatist claims, not to enhance them. That got through the legislature largely intact. There's still some unhappiness in Aceh, but with that in place, with local political parties, the Acehnese felt that they had extracted a fair deal on one hand, and that they would be largely in control of their own destiny afterwards, without achieving independence, but having a high level of autonomy, what we referred to as the 70% agreement. I think in this, and this is what I've talked about to a lot of independence movements, is when I say to them, what do you want? And they say, we want independence. I say, what does independence mean? What do you want to achieve through that? And I say, oh, we want education, healthcare, jobs, economic distribution, blah, blah, blah. I say, okay, why don't we aim for those things? Take independence off the table and let's look at what it is you actually want to achieve. That's what the Acehnese did, and that's the agreement that we ended up getting. I've spoken to a number of other organisations, and that's been, I wouldn't say a light bulb moment, but it's been a different way of approaching it, which has produced a much more flexible negotiating position, and which governments which are opposed to separatist movements are usually much more prepared to engage with. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
You talked about removing the spoilers in the negotiation process, taking those two generals out. If you regard the Indonesian army generally as a spoiler, how, during the implementation of the peace agreement, was there any evidence of the Indonesian military attempting at a lower level to sabotage the agreement? And if not, why not?
The agreement specified that one thing the Indonesian government always wanted to avoid, and the Indonesian military wanted to avoid, was the internationalisation of the conflict, that is, to bring in external actors. And part of the agreement was that this could only be achieved if the international community was represented on the ground. And that was through the Aceh monitoring mission, which comprised most of the countries of the EU and Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei. I think that was it. And that internationalisation put independent monitors on the ground, which were then able to report on infractions of the agreement by the Indonesian military. So there were a few problems in the implementation, but on balance, it went more smoothly than anybody could have reasonably have hoped for. And the fact that it's now lasted, 17, coming up 18 years is, I think, a testament to the essential soundness of the agreement that we put in place at that time.